I am Shona Fraser, and I am both a clinical and a neuropsychologist with a PhD in neuropsychology. And I am going to spend the next 4 lectures just taking us through the topic of neuropsychology. What is it? Why is it important? How can we use it effectively? And what does it mean for us in terms of how we formulate the patients that we see, or in terms of how we understand what somebody is experiencing? And so begins our 4-part series. So the first one, the lecture that we're going to be doing today, is functional neuroanatomy. And the reason that we're going to start here is because as neuropsychologists, we don't differentiate between the brain, the mind, and the body. So we realize that these are separate but inseparable. So we're sort of thinking always about how the brain is affecting the mind, and that both of these are embodied, and that the mind can also have an impact on the brain and the body. And so we're going to start off with the fundamentals of neuroanatomy. So what is actually going on in our brain? And then from there, we'll go into the neuropsychological syndromes. Some of these are very interesting, with what happens when different parts of our brain have any kind of damage, or when we have sort of these neurodevelopmental areas of the brain that are affected, which then kind of extend throughout the lifespan. We're then going to go into neuropsychological assessment, which is how we then start to assess these things. And we'll go into putting together neuropsych assessment batteries, when to assess, how we can make the batteries as efficient and effective as possible, and not over-assess patients and still get all the information that we need, and how we can start to make hypotheses with our knowledge of functional neuroanatomy and neuropsychological syndromes, which will then inform our assessment. And then finally, our neuropsychological rehabilitation is once we've assessed, once we know what's wrong with our patient, how do we help them? And so just looking at various ways of how neuropsychological rehabilitation has developed over the years as still a relatively new field, and how we can use these principles and these concepts in terms of kind of reorganizing structural deficits in the brain. So when we're thinking about morphology and landmarks, we have terms that we use to describe which direction we're going in whenever we're trying to sort of find something in the brain. So dorsal means on top, ventral means underneath, right is obviously right, left is obviously left, anterior is more towards the front, and posterior is more towards the back. And so you'll hear these terms quite often, especially when you are trying to orientate yourself in terms of where things are in the brain. This walnut-like structure is what is known to be the cortex. So the cortex is that outside section of the brain that we can see. And you can see there sort of posterior, so now going towards the back of the brain, we've got our cerebellum, and then we've got our brainstem. And that's one way of firstly orientating ourselves to the brain, is that the cerebellum will always be towards the back. And so in this particular image, if the cerebellum is towards the back, then we are seeing the left hemisphere in this picture. And so we're going to just begin with how we divide up the cortex, and then we'll go later on into subcortical structures of the brain. This is an image of if we were looking at the brain from underneath. So again, we can see anterior is more towards the front, posterior is more towards the back, and then we have our right and our left hemispheres, with the cerebellum slightly more posterior. And then sitting just anterior to the cerebellum there, we have our brainstem. Alright, so when I'm speaking about the left and the right hemisphere, effectively what I'm speaking about is the right half of the brain and the left half of the brain. So a hemisphere is really just the word that we use for that half of the brain. And these two hemispheres are then divided by a major groove in the surface of the brain, which is called a fissure. So a fissure is a very big groove. It's named in terms of its size and in terms of its width. And then we get these secondary grooves, which are known to be sulci or the sulcus. So you can see there that in order to make this sort of walnut-like picture, there's parts of the brain that fold in on themselves. And it's the grooves within the fold that are known to be the sulcus, or the plural is the sulci. You might also hear them as sulci. And So then what's kind of around the grooves, we've got these hills. So we've got the grooves, which is the sulcus, and then the hill, which is then known as the gyrus. And this is very important because a lot of our gyri and our sulci then are also responsible for how we can divide up the brain when we're looking at various landmarks.